Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever felt that invisible pressure? To conform, to make choices that kind of line up with what everyone else seems to expect, even if they don't feel quite right for you?
Hmm.
Or maybe you found yourself wondering, okay, where exactly is the line between my own freedom, my individual space, and what society can legitimately ask or even demand of me?
It's a fundamental question, really.
Really is. As old as civilization, practically, but it feels incredibly relevant right now, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
So today, we're taking a deep dive into a text that tackled these very questions head on. I mean, it really shaped how we've thought about freedom for generations. John Stuart Mill's On Liberty.
A cornerstone text.
Definitely. And our mission for you, our listener, is to help you quickly grasp the core philosophical ideas, the really powerful arguments, and why Mill's thinking still matters so much. Think of this as your shortcut, your way to get genuinely well-informed on one of history's most vital discussions about freedom.
Yeah, without having to wade through everything yourself necessarily.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're drawing directly from Mill's own words here, and I'm joined by an expert guide who's going to help us navigate these pretty profound ideas and pull out the clearest insights. So, when Mill sat down to write On Liberty, he wasn't getting lost in some, abstract philosophical maze about free will in the metaphysical sense. His focus was much more down to earth, much more relevant to you and me, civil or social liberty.
Right.
It's all about trying to figure out the legitimate power society can exercise over any one of us. And honestly, it's a question that still echoes in almost all our contemporary debates, even when we don't realize we're kind of wrestling with Mill's framework. Have you ever stopped to think about how society's power over us has actually shifted through history and what that means for our personal space today?
That's a perfect place to start because Mill himself points out how dramatically this idea of liberty has transformed. He takes us back, way back to ancient Greece, Rome, early England.
Okay.
And back then, liberty was mostly understood as protection against the tyranny of the political rulers.
Right, the king, the nobles.
Exactly. These rulers were seen as almost a separate species, often an antagonistic force. Mill uses this really vivid image. He compares them to an animal of prey stronger than the rest, and the people constantly needed defenses against its beak and claws.
Wow, okay, so very much a defensive posture.
Precisely. The struggle for liberty back then involved two main strategies. First, establishing certain political liberties or rights, basically, immunities. Things the ruler just shouldn't be allowed to violate. If they did, rebellion or resistance was seen as justified.
Got it. Don't cross these lines.
And second, developing constitutional checks. This meant requiring the consent of the community, or at least its representatives, for the government's major actions. For centuries, this was pretty much the goal, to protect the people from the government.
So a very clear us versus them kind of dynamic, the people needing these safeguards against a ruler who might be, well, oppressive.
Exactly that. But then, Mill points out, there was this pivotal shift in thinking. People started to think, well, maybe governors shouldn't have to be this independent, separate power. What if the rulers were just, tenants, delegates, revocable by the people themselves? The thinking went something like, if we choose our leaders and they're accountable to us, then their will is basically our will.
Ah, so we wouldn't need protection from ourselves, right?
That was the idea. It seemed logical. The nation couldn't possibly tyrannize itself, could it? Why would it need protection from its own decisions?
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, isn't it? Because that ideal, that dream of popular self-government, well, it didn't take long for it to reveal a whole new kind of threat, maybe even more insidious than any single king.
Absolutely. That's precisely Mill's point. The very success of popular government, he argues, uncovered a new form of oppression. He points out that self-government isn't really the government of each by himself. It's actually the government of each by all the rest. So the will of the people in practice often just means the will of the most numerous or the most active part, in other words, the majority. And this majority, it turns out, can very much want to oppress a part of their own number. Precautions are needed against this just as much as against any other abuse of power.
And this is where he introduces that famous concept.
Exactly, the tyranny of the majority.
Right.
And what makes this so formidable, Mill argues, is that society itself becomes the tyrant. It's not just about laws or political acts. It's about society imposing its own ideas and practices as rules of conduct on those who dissent.
So it goes deeper than just politics.
Much deeper. He says this social tyranny penetrates more deeply into the details of life and enslaving the soul itself. It leaves far fewer means of escape than, say, a bad law, because it shapes everything, your thoughts, your feelings, your character. It demands conformity not just in what you do, but in who you are.
That's, yeah, that's a profoundly unsettling idea when you really think about it. It makes you consider all those unwritten rules, those subtle social pressures we face every day, the ones that shape our choices without us even noticing sometimes. You know, how we dress, the careers we feel we should pursue, even which opinions are considered acceptable to voice.
It really leads us straight to Mill's fundamental question, which feels incredibly central today. Where to place the limit? How to make the fitting adjustment between individual independence and social control. Where is that line?
And finding that line is much harder than it sounds,
Yeah.
largely because of what Mill calls the magical influence of custom.
Custom. How so?
Well, custom, he explained, often feels like first nature, like it's just the way things obviously are. But really, it's a second nature we've learned. People tend to think their feelings, their gut reactions about certain behaviors are reason enough to make rules.
Like, I feel this is wrong, therefore it must be wrong for everyone. Exactly, without needing any deeper justification. They assume their feeling is universal, self-evident. Mill then dives into how these moral rules actually get formed. And, spoiler alert, it's rarely based on pure reason.
Okay, so what does shape them then?
Often, he says, it's things like class interests, or just the servility of mankind towards the supposed preferences or aversions of their temporal masters or of their gods. Think about historical examples he gives, like the morality between Spartans and their Helot slaves, or plantation owners and enslaved people. Those moral codes weren't about objective truth. They were largely shaped by the dominant group's interests and their feelings of superiority.
Wow. So these moral truths we sometimes hold so dearly, they might not be objective at all. They could just reflect historical preferences, power dynamics.
That's a huge part of Mill's analysis. They often reflect society's dominant likes and dislikes, which then get mistaken for self-evident moral laws. He does point out one historical exception, though. He says the only case in which the higher ground has been taken on principle and maintained with consistency is that of religious belief.
Religious freedom.
Right. Religious liberty became almost the sole battleground where individual rights were fought for on broad grounds of principle, asserting a right against society. But even here, there's a catch, a paradox.
Okay.
Religious freedom has hardly anywhere been practically realized, he argues, unless religious indifference kind of softened the opposition. Basically, when people stopped caring quite so much about what others believed.
So tolerance often came from apathy, not principle.
Often, yes. And even then, Mill notes, this toleration usually comes with tacit reserves. People draw lines saying, okay, believe that, but not this. The deep concern, Mill flags, is that wherever the sentiment of the majority is still genuine and intense, it is found to have abated little of its claim to be obeyed. That underlying power of the majority's feeling, not reason, to demand conformity, that threat remains very real.
Okay, so if this tyranny of the majority is such a pervasive and sneaky threat, what's Mill's answer? How do we guard against it? What's the principle he lays down as the bedrock for individual liberty against this really formidable power? So what does this all mean for how we actually define freedom in practice? He puts forward what he calls one very simple principle.
Deceptively simple, perhaps?
Right. And this principle is meant to govern all dealings between society and the individual. It's famously known as the harm principle.
That's the one.
Mill states it very clearly. The sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. That the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others.
It's a powerful restriction on societal power.
Hugely important. And he immediately clarifies what this doesn't justify. He says his own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. You cannot compel someone, force them to do something just because you think it will make them happier or wiser or morally better.
Even if you're absolutely convinced it's for their own good.
Exactly. You can reason with them, you can persuade them, you can entreat them, plead with them even. But you can never compel them for their own good. For the part of your conduct that only affects you, your independence is, or ought to be, absolute. And then comes that famous line, over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign.
A landmark declaration of autonomy.
Truly.
But, and this is crucial, it does come with some very important caveats, some foundational boundaries Mill himself sets.
Okay, like what?
Well, first he specifies this doctrine applies only to human beings in the maturity of their faculties. It doesn't cover children or young persons below the age defined by law. They need protection against their own actions as well as external injury. Nor does it apply, he argued, to what he called backward states of society. In those situations where the race is considered in its nonage, he controversially suggested despotism is a legitimate mode of government, provided the end be their improvement, and the means are justified by achieving that end. His reasoning was that liberty as a principle doesn't apply before mankind is capable of being improved by free and equal discussion.
That's a point that certainly invites debate today.
Absolutely. But for civilized nations capable of that free discussion, compulsion solely for an individual's own good is inadmissible. It's only justified for the security of others. Another vital point is Mill's philosophical grounding. He explicitly says he's not basing this on some abstract idea of natural right.
Oh, so where does it come from then?
He appeals to utility in the largest sense, grounded on the permanent interests of man as a progressive being.
Utility, like usefulness, happiness.
Yes, but in the largest sense, it's not just about immediate pleasure or preventing immediate pain. It's about what fosters long-term human development, intellectual growth, moral progress, and overall societal well-being. Individual liberty is valuable because it's essential for humanity to progress as a species.
Okay, so liberty serves this bigger goal of human flourishing.
Precisely. Now, about actions versus inaction. Interference is clearly okay for acts hurtful to others, but Mill also acknowledges we can rightfully be compelled to perform certain positive acts for the benefit of others. Things like giving evidence in court, paying your share for common defense, or saving someone's life. These are duties we owe to society, and failing to perform them can definitely cause harm. However, he adds a note of caution. Compelling someone not to do something that might lead to harm requires much more careful thought than preventing direct harm. Society really needs to weigh whether the individual might act better if left alone, or if interfering might actually create more problems than it solves.
Right. So it's not just about what you actively do to hurt others, but sometimes about what you fail to do that might cause harm. But there's a strong emphasis on being really cautious before society steps in, especially on the failure to act side. Okay, so this brings us to the practical side. What specific freedoms does this harm principle actually protect? What falls inside what Mill calls the appropriate region of human liberty?
Mill maps out 3 core domains, or spheres, where liberty should be absolute. Sometimes he lists 3, sometimes he breaks the third one down a bit.
Okay, what are they?
First, there's the inward domain of consciousness. This is fundamental. It demands absolute liberty of conscience, liberty of thought and feeling, absolute freedom of opinion and sentiment on absolutely all subjects, practical, speculative, scientific, moral, theological, you name it.
Total freedom inside your own head.
Exactly. Second, and he says this is practically inseparable from freedom of thought, is the liberty of expressing and publishing opinions. Because, well, what good is freedom of thought if you can't express those thoughts? While expressing opinions obviously involves others, the reasons for protecting it are almost identical to protecting thought itself. We'll get deeper into that soon.
Right. Thoughts need air.
Precisely. Third, the principle requires liberty of tastes and pursuits. This is about framing your own life plan to suit your own character, doing what you like, pursuing your own goals, and accepting the consequences without being impeded by others so long as what we do does not harm them, even if they think your choices are foolish, perverse, or just plain wrong.
Even if they disapprove strongly.
Even then, as long as no harm is done to others, Mill puts it beautifully. Mankind are greater gainers by suffering each other to live as seems good to themselves than by compelling each to live as seems good to the rest. And this sphere also implies the liberty of combination among individuals, the freedom to unite for any purpose that doesn't involve harming others, assuming everyone involved is of full age, not forced and not deceived.
So freedom of thought, freedom of expression, and freedom to live your life your way, including joining with others, that carves out a really significant space for individual freedom, doesn't it?
It does. A space grounded in preventing harm to others.
But how has society, historically, and maybe even in Mill's own time, pushed back against these liberties, especially in those areas he saw as vital for, well, human progress?
Well, this doctrine, as straightforward as it sounds, Mill observed, stood directly opposed to the general tendency of existing opinion and practice. It wasn't the norm. Historically, you look at ancient commonwealths like Greece or Rome. They felt totally justified in regulating almost every aspect of private conduct.
Why was that?
They believed the state had a profound interest in the physical and mental discipline of every single citizen. That might have been somewhat understandable, Mill concedes, for small republics constantly threatened by powerful enemies. But he saw a more subtle, more insidious trend in modern times.
Okay.
While direct legal interference in purely personal conduct might have lessened somewhat, he argued that the engines of moral repression have been wielded more strenuously against divergence from the reigning opinion in self-regarding than even in social matters.
Moral repression.
Yeah.
Like social pressure.
Exactly. Think about the lasting influence of Puritanism, he suggests, which often judged purely personal choices through a strict moral lens. Or even some contemporary reformers in his time whose social systems seemed aimed at establishing a despotism of society over the individual, albeit sometimes with philanthropic motives. And Mill issued this really stark warning, one that feels incredibly relevant today. He saw an increasing inclination to stretch unduly the powers of society over the individual. This tendency, this encroachment, he argued, is not one of the evils which tend spontaneously to disappear, but on the contrary, to grow more and more formidable.
Why did he think it was growing?
Because the tendency of mankind to impose their own opinions and preferences on others is backed by some powerful human feelings, and it finds support easily. He believed that unless a strong barrier of moral conviction can be raised against the mischief, we must expect to see it increase. And the most crucial battleground for raising that barrier, the area we absolutely need to delve into next, is the liberty of thought and discussion.
Right. So Mill takes this fight for liberty right to the core to what we think and what we say. He really frames the urgency here, arguing it's not just about protecting ourselves from government censorship anymore, though that still exists, but about guarding against the general intolerance of the public, that tyranny of opinion we talked about. Exactly. And to drive this home, Mill presents this incredibly powerful thought experiment. He says, imagine this. If all mankind minus one were of one opinion, and only one person were of the contrary opinion.
Just one lone dissenter.
Mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind. Wow, that really stops you in your tracks.
It's a profound statement about the value of dissent.
Absolutely. And he emphasizes the huge loss involved in silencing anyone. He calls it robbing the human race, posterity as well as the existing generation. Why? Because it cheats those who disagree with the opinion out of the chance to swap error for truth. And just as importantly, it cheats those who hold the opinion out of getting a clearer perception and livelier impression of truth that only comes from bumping up against error. It's basically a lose-lose for everybody involved.
It really is. And Mill doesn't just leave it there. He systematically lays out 4 incredibly compelling philosophical reasons why this freedom of discussion must be absolute.
Okay, let's break those down. What's the first one?
Reason 1. The suppressed opinion may actually be true.
Okay, seems obvious, but how does he argue it?
His core argument here is against what he calls assumed infallibility. Simple logic. Those who want to suppress an opinion are not infallible. To refuse to hear an opinion just because you're sure it's false is essentially to assume that their certainty is the same thing as absolute certainty.
Right. Being sure isn't the same as being God.
Exactly. Mill states it bluntly. All silencing of discussion is an assumption of infallibility. He reminds us constantly of human fallibility. Ages are no more infallible than individuals, he says. History is littered with opinions once held as absolutely certain, like a flat earth, or the divine right of kings that we now see as absurd.
Good point.
So while governments and individuals have a duty to form the truest opinions they can, they should only impose them when they're quite sure of being right. And how do we get quite sure? Not by shutting down debate, Mill argues, but by inviting it.
So testing your ideas is key.
Crucial. He tackles the argument head on. Some say, well, we have to act on our convictions. Mill replies, yes, but true conviction, the kind that justifies action, comes only after your opinion has withstood serious challenge. Complete liberty of contradicting and disproving our opinion, he insists, is the very condition which justifies us in assuming its truth for purposes of action. Our errors, he believed, are corrigible, fixable, but only through discussion and experience.
It's like forging steel and fire.
A great analogy. A truly wise person, Mill says, actively keeps their mind open to criticism, listens carefully to all that could be said against him, studies every variety of opinion. He declares, no wise man ever acquired his wisdom in any mode but this.
So wisdom isn't about having all the answers, but about being constantly willing to question them, even your own.
Exactly. It's about embracing the possibility of being wrong as the path to getting closer to right. He even uses the Catholic Church's practice of appointing a devil's advocate for canonizing saints as an example. Even they recognize the need to hear the strongest possible case against something before declaring it true. The best justified beliefs we have rest on a standing invitation to the whole world to prove them unfounded.
That's a high bar. It really makes you reflect, how often do we genuinely seek out the strongest arguments against our most cherished beliefs?
Rarely, for most of us, probably. And Mill cuts off another escape route. People might say, okay, fine, but we shouldn't allow questioning of opinions that are so certain they're essential for society's well-being. Mill calls this out as still just another assumption of infallibility.
Because who decides what's essential or certain?
Right. And he tackles the argument that some beliefs are just too useful or indispensable to be questioned. Mill counters that the usefulness of an opinion is itself matter of opinion, as disputable, as open to discussion, and requiring discussion as much as the opinion itself. You can't fairly discuss if something is useful if you're forbidden from discussing whether it's actually true. The truth of an opinion, he argues, is a fundamental part of its utility.
Okay, that makes sense. Truth and usefulness are linked.
Absolutely. And to hammer home the danger of silencing opinions believed to be immoral or impious, Mill brings up some heavy-hitting historical examples.
Like who?
Socrates, condemned to death for impiety and immorality, denying state gods, corrupting youth. Mill calls him the man who probably of all then born had the best claim to be Socrates, considered the most virtuous man of his time. Then Christ. Put to death ignominiously as a blasphemer by persecutors, Mill describes as generally well-intentioned, not bad men, not worse than men most commonly are, but caught up in the religious and moral feelings of their time. And perhaps the most striking example, Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor. Mill describes him as the gentlest and most amiable of philosophers and rulers, a man whose writings embody stoic virtue, almost a better Christian in all but the dogmatic sense. Yet this paragon of virtue persecuted Christianity. Why? Because he sincerely, conscientiously believed it was false and would undermine the existing society he felt bound to uphold.
That's chilling. Even the best intentions can lead to terrible mistakes if based on assumed certainty.
Precisely. Mill's devastating conclusion is, unless anyone who approves of punishment for the promulgation of opinions flatters himself that he is a wiser and better man than Marcus Aurelius, they should really refrain from that assumption of the joint infallibility of himself and the multitude.
A powerful warning.
And he demolishes the comforting idea, the pleasant falsehood, that truth always triumphs over persecution eventually. History teems with instances, he says, of truth put down by persecution. He points to the Reformation being stamped out multiple times before Luther, and Protestantism being eradicated in Spain, Italy, Flanders, where persecution was relentless. Persecution has always succeeded, he states starkly, save where the heretics were too strong a party to be effectually persecuted. Truth's only real advantage is that, being true, it might be rediscovered time and again over the ages, until conditions finally allow it to take root and flourish. It doesn't have magical powers against force.
So it can't just sit back and assume truth will win out on its own.
Not at all. In Mill's own time, 19th century England, while overt executions for heresy were gone, he pointed to the rags and remnants of persecution. Things like imprisonment for offensive words about Christianity, or atheists being rejected as jurymen because they couldn't take a religious oath, which Mill called suicidal, as it let in liars while excluding the honest who wouldn't lie about their beliefs. But even more potent, he argued, was the social stigma, the social intolerance. This was really effective in England, making people far more hesitant to express unpopular opinions than in places where they might face actual legal penalties. People would disguise their opinions, keep them quiet, or abstain from any active effort for their diffusion. Opinions would just smolder in narrow circles of thinkers,
leading to intellectual stagnation.
Exactly. The greatest harm, Mill argued, wasn't even to the heretics themselves, but to those who are not heretics and whose whole mental development is cramped and their reason cowed by the fear of heresy. He declares passionately that No one can be a great thinker who does not recognize that as a thinker, it is his first duty to follow his intellect to whatever conclusions it may lead. It really makes you think, doesn't it? How often might our own society, maybe unconsciously, enforce this kind of intellectual pacification, where truly bold, challenging thinking gets quietly discouraged? Mill explicitly links the great periods of intellectual flourishing, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, to times when the yoke of authority was broken.
That's a powerful and, frankly, quite sobering assessment. It underscores just how precious and maybe how fragile genuine intellectual freedom really is. Okay, so that's the first reason the silenced opinion might be true. What about the second? What if the silenced opinion is actually wrong? Does it still have any value? Why shouldn't we suppress it then?
Yes, this is just as important. Mill's second reason is,
Though the silenced opinion be an error, it may, and very commonly does, contain a portion of truth.
okay, so even wrong ideas might have something useful in them.
Precisely. Mill argues that the prevailing opinion on any complex subject is rarely or never the whole truth. It's almost always incomplete. Therefore, it's only by the collision of adverse opinions that the remainder of the truth have any chance of being supplied.
Like putting puzzle pieces together.
Exactly. He contends that often conflicting doctrines share the truth between them. The popular opinion might be largely true, but often exaggerated, distorted, and disjoined from other equally important truths that should limit or qualify it. Heretical opinions, the ones that get suppressed, are frequently just these suppressed and neglected truths, bursting forth, demanding to be heard, even if they also present only one side of the story.
So both sides might be partly right and partly wrong.
Very often, yes. He even suggests that sometimes unpopular truths need one-sided asserters because they are often the most energetic and the most likely to compel reluctant attention to the fragment of wisdom which they proclaim as if it were the whole.
Can you give an example?
He uses Rousseau in the 18th century. Rousseau's ideas, his paradoxes about the superior worth of simplicity of life or the demoralizing effect of artificial society contain plenty of exaggeration, Mill admits. But they provided a much-needed salutary shock to the prevailing, also one-sided, opinions of the Enlightenment elite. Rousseau added necessary truths that were being overlooked.
Okay, I see. Shaking things up can reveal hidden truths.
Right. In politics, Mill observes, you almost always have parties of order or stability and parties of progress or reform. Both, he says, are necessary elements of a healthy state of political life. Each acts as a check on the other, benefiting from the other's opposing tendencies. Truth, in practical matters, he argues, is often about reconciling and combining of opposites. And you can't do that unless both sides are freely and vigorously expressed.
So the minority viewpoint is actually vital.
Absolutely vital. He says the minority opinion, for the time being, represents the neglected interests, the side of human well-being which is in danger of obtaining less than its share. It forces the majority to consider things it might otherwise ignore.
Does he apply this to morality too?
He does, quite controversially for his time, using Christian morality as an example. He argues that what's commonly called Christian morality, while containing great beauty and value, is often presented as the whole truth, when it's really incomplete and one-sided.
In what way?
He suggests its ideal is often negative rather than positive, passive rather than active. There's a lot of thou shalt not, less emphasis on active virtue. He also argues its motives, focusing on heavenly reward or punishment, can give morality an essentially selfish character, sometimes disconnecting duty from love of fellow humans. He contrasts it with, say, classical pagan ethics, where duty to the state held a high place, or where virtues like magnanimity, personal dignity, even a sense of honor came from purely human, not exclusively religious, education.
So he's not dismissing Christian ethics, but saying it needs other perspectives.
Exactly. Mill's argument is that for the moral regeneration of mankind, we need other ethics than any one which can be evolved from exclusively Christian sources to exist alongside Christian ethics. Each complements the other. The real danger, he says, is the exclusive pretension, made by a part of the truth to be the whole, that must and ought to be protested against. The greatest evil isn't the violent conflict between parts of the truth, but the quiet suppression of half of it. Our only hope for finding the whole truth, he concludes, is when people are forced to listen to both sides.
That's a brilliant way of looking at it. Even error or partial truth plays a crucial role in getting us closer to the full picture. Suppressing it actually impoverishes our understanding. So the key insight here seems to be that full truth often emerges from this vibrant, maybe even uncomfortable clash of opposing, often incomplete viewpoint.
Precisely. It's the collision that generates light.
Which leads us perfectly into Mill's third powerful reason for free discussion. What's that one?
Okay, reason 3. Even if the received opinion be not only true, but the whole truth, unless it is suffered to be, and actually is, vigorously and earnestly contested, it will be held in the manner of a prejudice, with little comprehension or feeling of its rational grounds.
Wow. So even if you're 100% right, if nobody challenges you, your belief becomes weak, like a prejudice.
Exactly. Mill argues that merely passively accepting a truth without deeply understanding why it's true means truth, thus held, is but one superstition the more. It's not genuine knowledge, it's just rote acceptance. The intellect, he emphasizes, isn't truly exercised or cultivated unless you learn the grounds of one's own opinions.
You have to know the why.
You have to know the why. And for most important subjects, morals, religion, politics, social relations, anything beyond simple mathematics, the why is complicated. Unlike geometry, where proofs are generally one-sided, in these areas, the truth depends on a balance to be struck between two sets of conflicting reasons. You need to understand the arguments against your position just as well, maybe even better, than the arguments for it.
He quotes Cicero, right? About knowing your opponent's case.
He does. He cites Cicero's practice of studying his adversary's case with greater intensity than his own. Mill drives the point home. He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. He observes that even most educated men fall into this trap. They might know the arguments for their side, but they've never really thrown themselves into the mental position of those who think differently. As a result, they do not, in any proper sense of the word, know the doctrine which they themselves profess. They haven't truly grappled with the counter-arguments.
So it's like knowing the answer, but not how you got there.
Precisely. And Mill goes even further. He says if actual opponents don't exist, it is indispensable to imagine them and supply them with the strongest arguments which the most skillful devil's advocate can conjure up. You have to actively seek out the challenge.
Create your own opposition if needed.
Yes. He contrasts this with modern education, even in his time, lamenting that unlike the Socratic dialectics, or even the flawed school disputations of the Middle Ages, contemporary methods often fail to compel students to truly hear both sides. He stresses the undervalued importance of negative logic, the skill of pointing out weaknesses, fallacies, and errors in arguments as absolutely essential for attaining any positive knowledge or conviction worthy the name.
So it's almost like being on a debate team. You don't truly understand your own position until you've rigorously studied and can articulate your opponent's strongest points. Is that kind of the idea here? Without that challenge, even absolute truth can become just a dead dogma.
That's a perfect analogy. It loses its vitality.
Which leads directly into Mill's fourth and final reason for why free discussion is so critical.
Exactly right. That dead dogma phenomenon connects straight to Mill's final point.
The meaning of the doctrine itself will be in danger of being lost or enfeebled and deprived of its vital effect on the character and conduct.
So the truth might still be technically known, but it loses its punch. Its meaning fades.
Precisely. Mill explains that when discussion ceases, the very words conveying a truth stop evoking vivid ideas, or they only suggest a tiny fraction of their original rich meaning. Instead of a vivid conception and a living belief, what remains are only a few phrases retained by rote. It becomes a mere shell and husk of meaning, with the finer essence being lost.
Can you give an example of how this happens?
He describes what he calls the life cycle of creeds. Doctrines are full of meaning and vitality, he says, when they're struggling for acceptance, when people are fighting for them. But once a doctrine prevails and becomes the general opinion, the controversy dies down, discussion fades, and then the doctrine tends to become hereditary, just passed down, received passively, not actively.
It just becomes something everyone knows.
Right, leading to the dead belief phenomenon. He uses Christian doctrines as a prime example. He observes that most believers in his time gave lip service, homage, to core ethical maxims like, blessed are the poor, or judge not, lest ye be judged. But their real allegiance, their actual guide for conduct, was usually just the custom of his nation, or their social class. They technically believe the doctrines, he says, as people believe what they have always heard lauded and never discussed, but not with the kind of living belief which regulates conduct. The meaning hasn't sunk in.
What's fascinating here is that he contrasts this with the early Christians. He says because they were actively fighting for their creed against opposition, they had a much livelier feeling of the meaning of their creed, which explains why it spread so effectively. He suggests this lack of vitality, this disconnect between professed belief and actual understanding, is why Christianity, in his view, made so little progress in extending its domain in his time and often failed to deeply impact believers' lives.
Exactly. He calls the state the deep slumber of a decided opinion. He observes that for all traditional doctrines, people often only truly learn the meaning when some kind of direct experience, generally of a painful kind, has made it a reality to them. Otherwise, the words just remain words.
So struggle and challenge are what keep ideas alive and meaningful.
That's the core idea. Now, he does address a counter-argument. Does this mean unanimity is always bad? Should we want constant disagreement? Mill says no, of course not. As mankind improves, the number of doctrines that are beyond dispute will hopefully grow. That's progress. But, he insists, the loss of vigorous discussion around even established truths is still a significant drawback. It diminishes our intelligent and living apprehension of a truth. He suggests that educators need to find ways to substitute for this loss, maybe through methods like Socratic dialogues, to keep the challenges and complexities of an issue alive in the learner's mind.
Okay, so even with established truths, we need to keep probing the why. Before we move on from thought and discussion, Mill also talks about the manner of discussion, right? Like how politely people argue.
Yes, he addresses that head on. He acknowledges that, sure, opinions can be expressed offensively, intemperately, but he strongly challenges the idea that we should restrict what is said based on how it's said, based on perceived temperance.
Why challenge that? Seems reasonable to want polite debate.
Because, he points out, offense is often taken precisely when an argument is telling and powerful against a prevailing opinion. People feel attacked when their cherished beliefs are effectively challenged. And he highlights a common hypocrisy. Invective, sarcasm, personality, and similar tactics are roundly condemned when used against prevailing opinions. But they are often praised as honest zeal and righteous indignation when used by the majority against unpopular dissenters.
Double standard.
A clear double standard. So Mill's moral for public discussion is this. Law and authority should have no business with restraining either side based on the manner of expression. Instead, public opinion, through judgment and taste, should condemn things like want of candor or malignity, bigotry, or intolerance of feeling, regardless of which side displays them. But crucially, we should never infer these vices from the side which a person takes, however unpopular it may be. The ideal, he suggests, is to give credit and honor to those who can state their opponent's case fairly, who exaggerate nothing against them, and who keep nothing back that might support the opposing view.
That's a really profound ideal for how we should conduct public discourse, especially compared to how things often look today, isn't it? It challenges us to focus on intellectual honesty and fairness, not just on whether we agree or disagree, or whether someone hurts our feelings. The core insight running through all four reasons is that censorship, even with the best intentions, ultimately impoverishes everyone. It stifles potential truths, yes, but it also drains the life out of the truths we think we already possess. Okay, we've spent a good chunk of time on the absolute necessity of freedom of thought and expression. So what does this all mean for how we actually live our lives? How does this connect to our actions?
Mill makes that connection explicitly. He argues that the very same reasons demanding freedom of opinion also require logically that men should be free to act upon their opinions, to carry these out in their lives without hindrance. As long as it's at their own risk and peril, and doesn't cause harm to others. He's quick to reiterate that crucial point. Actions that are harmful, that prejudice the rights or interests of others, absolutely do require social and, if necessary, legal control. Society has a right to protect itself. But in that sphere of action that concerns only oneself, individuality should be allowed, even encouraged, to assert itself freely.
So freedom to live according to your beliefs, provided you don't harm others.
Exactly. And this transition from thought to action is where Mill really delves into the profound importance of individuality, not just as a personal preference, but as something essential for both human development and societal flourishing. He calls for different experiments of living.
Experiments of living, like trying out different lifestyles.
Precisely. Just as diverse opinions are useful for finding truth, diverse experiments of living are useful for discovering better ways to live, better modes of existence. He argues for giving free scope to varieties of character as long as they don't injure others.
But does society generally value that? Variety, individuality.
That's the problem Mill identifies. He laments society's general indifference to the end itself, that end being the free development of individuality. Most people, he observes, simply don't recognize its intrinsic worth. They don't see it as essential for civilization, instruction, education, culture. For the majority, who are often content with the way things are, spontaneity, originality, individuality, these are often viewed with suspicion, maybe even jealousy, seen as a troublesome and perhaps rebellious obstruction to whatever plan the mainstream thinks is best for everyone.
So conformity feels safer, easier for the majority.
Much safer. Mill draws heavily here on the ideas of Wilhelm von Humboldt, a German philosopher. Humboldt argued that the true end of man is the highest and most harmonious development of his powers to a complete and consistent whole. And to achieve this, Humboldt said, requires two things above all: freedom and a variety of situations. These conditions allow for individual vigor and manifold diversity, which in turn combine to create originality.
Freedom and variety leading to originality and full human development.
That's the ideal. But standing squarely in the way is the tyranny of custom. Mill argues that conforming to custom merely because it is custom is detrimental. It does not educate or develop in him any of the qualities which are the distinctive endowment of a human being.
Why not? What's wrong with following custom?
Because, Mill says, using a striking analogy, he who does anything because it is the custom makes no choice. He gains no practice either in discerning or in desiring what is best. Your human faculties, perception, judgment, discriminative feeling, mental activity, even moral preference are only exercised when you make choices. If you just follow the crowd, those muscles atrophy.
You become passive.
Right. He uses another powerful analogy. Human nature is not a machine to be built after a model, but a tree, which requires to grow and develop itself on all sides, according to the tendency of the inward forces that make it a living thing. Custom tries to force everyone into the same mold.
What about desires and impulses? Society often tells us to control those, right?
Mill pushes back strongly against that, too. He argues that desires and impulses are as much a part of a perfect human being as beliefs and restraints. Strong impulses aren't inherently bad. They're only perilous when not properly balanced, when one set grows weak while others become overly strong. Strong impulses are simply another name for energy, he says, and energy can be turned to great good. They are the raw material of human nature.
So we shouldn't try to stamp them out.
No, society should aim to cultivate and balance this energy, not suppress it. He makes a crucial distinction. A person whose desires and impulses are his own is said to have a character. One whose desires and impulses are not his own has no character, no more than a steam engine has a character. If you just conform, you lack that authentic core.
Wow. That's a strong statement. Having character means having your own desires.
Your own properly developed desires and impulses. Mill then observes something crucial about his own time, the mid-19th century. He contrasts it with past eras where maybe individuality was in excess, where lack of control was the issue. But in his present, he says, the danger which threatens human nature is not the excess, but the deficiency of personal impulses and preferences.
Really? A lack of strong desires.
Yes. People live, he says, as under the eye of a hostile and dreaded censorship. Instead of asking, what do I prefer, or what suits my character, or even, what would allow the best and highest in me to have fair play and enable it to grow and thrive, they ask. What is suitable to my position? What is usually done by persons of my station and circumstances, or worse, what is usually done by persons of a station and circumstances superior to mine?
Ouch. That sounds familiar.
Doesn't it? The result, Mill warns, is that their human capacities are withered and starved. They become incapable of any strong wishes or native pleasures. They lose their individuality, their authentic selves.
He connects this to religious views too, right?
Yeah.
Calvinism versus a Greek ideal.
He does. He critiques what he sees as the core of Calvinistic theory. The one great offense of man is self-will. All the good of which humanity is capable is comprised in obedience. Under this view, crushing human faculties, capacities, and susceptibilities isn't evil. It's good if it leads to surrender. This produces, Mill argues, a pinched and hidebound type of human character. He counters that a good creator would surely want faculties cultivated, not rooted out. He argues that pagan self-assertion is just as much an element of human worth as Christian self-denial. They need to be blended. He famously says he prefers the ideal of Pericles, representing Athenian self-development, to that of John Knox, representing strict religious conformity.
So individuality isn't just about personal fulfillment. Mill argues it actually benefits society as a whole, doesn't he? How does that work?
Absolutely. It's not just a private good, it's a public good. Mill contends that it is not by wearing down into uniformity, but by cultivating it and calling it forth, that human beings become a noble and beautiful object of contemplation. As individuals develop their unique capacities, each person becomes more valuable to himself and is therefore capable of being more valuable to others. There's simply more life, more richness in the society when the individuals composing it are more developed.
More interesting people make a more interesting society.
And a more productive one in the broadest sense. He specifically highlights the critical need for originality and genius. These individuals, the ones who think new thoughts, discover new truths, or, just as importantly, commence new practices and set the example of more enlightened conduct and better taste and sense in human life, these people are the salt of the earth. Without them, human life would become a stagnant pool.
But society isn't always kind to geniuses or originals, is it?
Notoriously not. Mill emphasizes that genius can only breathe freely in an atmosphere of freedom. Society shouldn't try to force these exceptional individuals into its pre-existing molds. If they're forced to conform, society gains little from their potential genius. If they're strong enough to break the mold, society often labels them wild, erratic, or worse, making them targets instead of appreciating their contribution.
That connects to his concerns about mediocrity, right?
Yes. He saw a growing tendency in modern society for mediocrity to be the ascendant power among mankind. Public opinion, which increasingly rules the world, is often the opinion of collective mediocrity. In such an environment, he argues, the counterpoise and corrective would be the more and more pronounced individuality of those who stand on the higher eminences of thought. Their very nonconformity, their eccentricity even, is itself a service. When custom becomes tyrannical, eccentricity becomes a virtue because it marks the chief danger of the time, the crushing weight of conformity.
So being different is actually a form of valuable resistance.
A necessary resistance. He also champions the need for diversity of life paths. Human beings are not like sheep, he insists. Different people require different physical and moral agencies to thrive. Just as different plants need different soils and climates, different humans need different conditions for their spiritual development. Without allowing for this diversity of life modes, people not only lose happiness, but they fail to achieve the mental and moral stature they're capable of.
But public opinion often doesn't tolerate much diversity, does it?
Exactly. Mill critiques public opinion's intolerance. It might grudgingly accept diversity in major life choices if forced, but it often condemns merely doing what nobody does or not doing what everybody does as if it were a serious moral failing. He sees a dangerous philanthropic spirit emerging that wants to make everyone conform to one approved standard of conduct, essentially wanting people to desire nothing strongly, which leads inevitably to weak feelings and weak energies, a bland uniformity.
It sounds almost like a prophecy, especially when Mill brings up the example of China and then turns his gaze to Europe.
It really does. He uses China as this stark cautionary tale. He acknowledges their early achievements, but argues that the absolute despotism of custom made them stationary. They succeeded beyond all hope, he says with irony, in making a people all alike, ensuring everyone thought and did the same things according to ancient rules, and the result was stagnation.
And he saw Europe heading that way.
He warned that Europe, despite its historical diversity, which he saw as the source of its progress, was decidedly advancing towards the Chinese ideal of making all people alike. What was driving this? Political changes, reducing class distinctions, expanding education, often standardized, improved communication, bringing people into closer contact, growing commerce, promoting similar desires and lifestyles, and above all, the ascendancy of public opinion in the state. All these forces were pushing towards uniformity.
So the message to the listener, even back then, was urgent.
It's extremely urgent. He argues, if the claims of individuality are ever to be asserted, the time is now, while much is still wanting to complete the enforced assimilation. If resistance waits until life is reduced nearly to one uniform type, then all deviations from that type will come to be considered impious, immoral, even monstrous, and contrary to nature. The window for preserving diversity was closing. The core insight here is absolutely critical. Society thrives not through enforced uniformity, but through the rich, unpredictable tapestry woven by diverse, freely developing individuals, each finding and forging their own unique path.
Which then raises that crucial practical question.
Exactly. Given these profound principles of liberty and individuality, how do we actually apply them? How do we navigate the boundaries? Where does society's legitimate authority end and individual sovereignty begin?
Right, that brings us squarely to the practical application. How does Mill draw the line? He actually boils it down to two fundamental maxims before getting into the specific, often tricky applications. Can you remind us what those are?
Sure. They summarize the core principles we've discussed. First, The individual is not accountable to society for his actions, insofar as these concern the interests of no person but himself. Society's only recourse here is advice, instruction, persuasion, or avoidance if they disapprove strongly.
Okay, self-regarding acts are your own business.
Pretty much. Second, for such actions as are prejudicial to the interests of others, the individual is accountable and may be subjected either to social or to legal punishments if society is of opinion that the one or the other is requisite for its protection.
Right. Harm others and society can step in.
Those are the guiding principles. But, as Mill immediately shows, applying them gets complicated fast.
How so? Let's refine what harm to others or prejudicial to the interests of others really means in practice.
Okay, well first, Mill clarifies that not all negative impacts on others justify interference. Take legitimate competition. Think about winning a job someone else wanted, or succeeding in an overcrowded profession where others fail. Your success inevitably causes loss or disappointment to others, but society generally accepts this kind of harm as necessary for the greater good and only steps in if you used fraud or treachery and force.
Okay, so fair competition, even if it hurts someone, is usually allowed.
Generally, yes. Then he looks at trade. He considers trade a social act, because when you sell something, you affect the interests of others, buyers, competitors. So trade, in principle, falls under society's jurisdiction. Historically, governments often tried to fix prices or regulate manufacturing.
Right.
But experience showed, Mill argues, that the principle of free trade, letting producers and sellers operate freely, checked only by buyers having the equal freedom to choose, is generally the best way to ensure quality and cheapness. However, he's careful to distinguish this economic principle from the principle of individual liberty we've been discussing. They rest on different grounds, though both argue against intervention.
So regulating trade for safety or fairness is okay.
Yes. Mill says things like preventing fraud, enforcing sanitary precautions, protecting workers in dangerous trades. These are legitimate exercises of authority. They aren't really infringements on the liberty of the producer, but rather necessary regulations for the good others. However, things like the Maine Law, alcohol prohibition in some U.S. states, or prohibiting the importation of opium, that, Mill argues, is an infringement, not primarily on the liberty of the seller, but on the liberty of the buyer. It aims to make it impossible for people to obtain a commodity for their own, potentially self-regarding use.
Interesting distinction. Interfering with the consumer's choice is the liberty issue there.
Exactly. This leads him to the whole area of police functions, preventing crime and accidents. Preventing crime is obviously a core government function, but the preventative function, he warns, is far more liable to be abused to the prejudice of liberty.
How can prevention be abused?
Well, think about stopping someone before they commit a crime. If a crime is clearly about to happen, say, you see someone clearly about to cross a bridge you know is unsafe, and there's no time to warn them, then seizing them and pulling them back isn't a violation of their liberty, Mill argues. Why? Because liberty consists in doing what one desires, and he does not desire to fall into the river. You're acting on their presumed real desire, not wanting to die.
Okay, clear and present danger allows intervention.
But, he cautions, when there's only a risk or danger of harm, not a certainty, then a mature individual ought to be only warned of the danger, not forcibly prevented from exposing himself to it. The final judgment of the risk should be theirs alone.
So warn, but don't force if it's just a risk to themselves.
That's the principle. He applies this to selling poisons, requiring labels warning of danger. Fine. Buyers don't desire to be ignorant of the danger. But requiring, say, a doctor's certificate for every purchase. Too restrictive. It hinders legitimate uses. His practical suggestion is using what Bentham called pre-appointed evidence.
Meaning?
Essentially, mandatory record-keeping. For poisons, require the seller to log the date, buyer's name and address, the exact quantity and quality sold, and the stated purpose. This creates a record that could be used later if a crime occurs, acting as a deterrent, without unduly restricting legitimate access for those who need poisons for valid reasons.
Okay, so finding that balance again, precautions that deter misuse without blocking legitimate use, is quite precise, isn't it?
Very much trying to be precise.
But what about behaviors that are mainly self-regarding, but society still finds problematic, like, say, excessive drinking or idleness? How does the harm principle apply there?
Right, this is where the lines get fuzzier. Take drunkenness. Generally, Mill says it's not a matter for legal punishment. It's self-regarding. But UT, if a person has a documented history of committing violence against others when drunk, then, Mill argues, the making himself drunk becomes a crime against others. In that specific case, society might be justified in placing a special legal restriction on that individual, maybe forbidding them access to alcohol. The act itself, getting drunk, becomes punishable because of the high probability of harm to others based on past behavior.
Okay, so context and history matter. What about idleness?
Similar logic. Simple idleness, avoiding labor, isn't generally punishable by law unless the person is receiving public support or breaks a contract by being idle. But if that idleness leads to the failure to perform a legal duty towards others, like failing to support one's children, then it is no tyranny to force him to fulfill that obligation, potentially by compelled labor if necessary. The consequence of the idleness, harm to dependents, justifies intervention.
So the link back to harming others is key.
Always. He also mentions acts that are primarily self-harming, but, if done publicly, are a violation of good manners. These then fall within the category of offenses against others, may rightfully be prohibited. He gives the example of offenses against public decency. The public nature of the act creates the harm to others.
Okay. Now, what about the really tricky area of influencing others towards potentially harmful self-regarding acts, like advising someone to gamble excessively?
Ah, yes, the dilemma of counseling or instigating vices. If individuals are free to do certain self-regarding acts, like gambling or fornication, as Mill mentions, should others be free to advise or encourage them?
Seems like freedom of speech should cover advice.
Right. Mill's initial principle is exactly that. Whatever it is permitted to do, it must be permitted to advise to do. Seems consistent. But then comes the complication. What if the advisor or instigator profits from it? Think of a pimp or a gambling housekeeper.
Ah, they have a vested interest.
Exactly. This creates classes of persons with an interest opposed to what is considered as the public weal. They have a direct financial incentive to promote behavior that society, rightly or wrongly, deems harmful. Mill acknowledges the conflicting arguments here. On one hand, if the act itself is tolerated, making an occupation out of promoting it shouldn't automatically be criminal. Society should just try to dissuade people. On the other hand, some argue society is justified in assuming the conduct is at least disputable and can therefore restrict disinterested solicitations from those who have a clear vested interest in promoting potentially wrong acts.
Does Mill take a firm stance?
He actually says he won't try to definitively resolve this moral anomaly, where you might punish the accessory, the instigator, but not the principal, the person doing the act. He notes such prohibitions are often ineffective anyway, but he does draw a line when it comes to sellers of things like stimulants, alcohol. While they profit from potential excess, their products are also indispensably required for the sake of their legitimate use. This justifies restrictions and guarantees like licensing, setting hours of operation, but not outright prohibition, because that would infringe too much on the liberty of the buyer who wants to use the product legitimately.
Okay, so regulate the circumstances of sale, but don't ban the product entirely if it has legitimate uses. What about indirect discouragement? Like, should the state make things like alcohol more expensive through taxes?
Mill thinks this is generally admissible, if the primary goal is raising revenue. If the state needs tax revenue anyway, it has a duty, he argues, to choose commodities whose consumption, beyond a very moderate quantity, is generally considered positively injurious. So, imposing heavy taxes on stimulants, up to the point where it maximizes revenue before smuggling becomes rampant, is okay. It serves a public purpose, revenue, while incidentally discouraging excessive consumption.
But what about limiting access, like reducing the number of pubs or bars?
That Mill finds problematic. Limiting the number of places to buy alcohol, he argues, exposes all to an inconvenience because there are some by whom the facility would be abused. It treats the working classes, in particular, as children or savages who can't be trusted with temptation. He thinks such direct controls on access are only justifiable if all efforts to educate people for freedom and self-control have completely and utterly failed. It's a last resort, deeply paternalistic.
It's fascinating how consistently he tries to protect individual choice, even when dealing with potentially harmful behaviors. What's also fascinating is how he extends this idea of liberty, even to the freedom not to be free, talking about things like slavery contracts.
Yes, this is a really important exception that proves the rule. While individuals should generally be free to make agreements and commitments, Mill argues the principle of freedom cannot require that he should be free not to be free. Selling oneself into slavery, he says, is an act that should be legally void.
Why, if it's a free choice?
Because by that single act, the person abrogates his liberty, he forgoes any future use of it beyond that single act. He essentially forfeits the very foundation freedom upon which his future choices depend. It's not an exercise of freedom, it's the alienation of freedom itself. So the state is right not to recognize such a contract.
That makes sense. It undermines the whole principle. He touches on marriage, too, doesn't he, referencing Humboldt?
Briefly, he mentions Humboldt's view that personal engagements, like marriage, if they involve complex feelings, ideally shouldn't be legally binding for life, but should be dissolvable by the will of the parties. Mill doesn't fully endorse making them easily dissolvable by law, especially once the situation involves others. He acknowledges that when engagements lead others to build expectations, or especially when they bring third parties into existence, children, then a new series of moral obligations arises. These obligations create duties towards those third parties and make a great difference in the moral freedom of the original parties to dissolve the relationship, even if their legal freedom remains. The impact on others changes the moral calculus.
Okay, so responsibilities to others constrain absolute freedom here.
Right. And Mill then turns this around to criticize what he sees as misplaced notions of liberty when it comes to parental duties towards children. He argues forcefully that society often fails to enforce parents' moral obligations. He considers it a moral crime for a parent to bring a child into existence without having a reasonable prospect of providing for its basic needs and, crucially, for its instruction and training for its mind. Failing to provide education is a serious wrong, both to the child and to society.
And the state should step in.
Yes, the state ought to see it fulfilled. He even suggests that laws forbidding marriage unless the parties can show they have the means to support a family are not objectionable as violations of liberty. They are preventing a foreseeable harm to potential children.
What about the state's role in education itself? Should the state provide education?
Mill argues the state should require and compel the education up to a certain standard of every human being. It's a duty owed to the child. But, and this is a massive but, there's a crucial distinction. The state should enforce education, but not necessarily provide or direct it all.
Why not? Why shouldn't the state run all the schools?
Because, Mill warns, a general state education is a mere contrivance for molding people to be exactly like one another. And molding people to be alike is exactly what the state, especially if it's run by the dominant majority, wants. It creates a despotism over the mind, leaning towards conformity.
So state-mandated education, but not state-controlled education.
Ideally, yes. He advocates for diversity of education. Let parents choose among various options. The state could perhaps provide schools as one among many competing experiments, a model, but not a monopoly. It could enforce attendance and ensure quality through public examinations, but these exams should focus on facts and positive science, things that can be objectively known, not on contested opinions in areas like religion or politics. The state certifies knowledge, not belief systems.
That's a nuanced position.
It reflects his deep suspicion of centralized power over thought. He points out the irony. Mankind often shows a strange respect for liberty by letting parents neglect their children's education, harming others, while simultaneously showing a strange want of respect for it by restricting adults' harmless, self-regarding pleasures.
It's a fascinating contradiction. Now, before we wrap up, Mill also identifies some objections to government interference that go beyond direct liberty issues, right? Reasons to limit government even when it's not technically violating the harm principle.
Yes, that's right. He outlines 3 general objections to government intervention, even in areas where it might seem beneficial and doesn't directly coerce individuals against their will.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is pretty straightforward: inefficiency. Often, the individuals concerned can simply do the thing better themselves than the government can. They have more direct knowledge and a stronger stake in the outcome.
Makes sense. Private enterprise, individual initiative.
Exactly. The second objection is more closely related to the theme of individuality. It's about mental education and development. Even if the government could potentially do something more efficiently, letting individuals or voluntary groups do it themselves provides invaluable mental education. It strengthens their active faculties, exercising their judgment, and gathering information.
So doing things for yourself makes you smarter, more capable.
Yes, and more engaged as a citizen. Mill gives examples like participating in jury trials for non-professional judges, getting involved in local parish or municipal institutions, and running philanthropic or industrial associations voluntarily. These activities are the practical part of the political education of a free people. They take people out of their narrow personal concerns, accustom them to handling joint interests, and acting for public motives.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, These are the very things that build the kind of active, thoughtful citizens Mill believed were essential for a healthy, free society. It's about cultivating participants, not just passive subjects waiting for the government to act.
Precisely. It builds civic capacity from the ground up. Then comes the third, and what Mill calls the most cogent reason for restricting government interference: the unnecessary increase of government power.
The danger of big government.
Exactly. Every function the government takes on adds to its influence, its patronage, its control over people's hopes and fears. It increases the tendency for the most ambitious and active parts of the public to become dependent on the government, either as direct employees or as recipients of favors.
Leading to a powerful bureaucracy.
Potentially a dominant, potentially stagnant one. If you concentrate all the top talent of a country within the governing bureaucracy, Mill warns you risk two things. Either the bureaucracy falls into indolent routine, or it pursues half-examined crudities based on its limited perspective. To be effective and progressive, a bureaucracy needs watchful criticism of equal ability outside the body. It needs independent centers of thought and power to challenge it.
He uses Russia as an example, right?
Yes, the Russian Empire of his time. He argues the Tsar himself is often powerless against the bureaucratic body because they can effectively veto policies simply by not actively implementing them. In contrast, he points to the American people's capacity for civil enterprise or the French military's effectiveness. Examples of people accustomed to managing complex affairs outside direct, minute government control, making them more capable and resilient. His conclusion is stark. The absorption of all the principal ability of the country into the governing body is fatal to the mental activity and progressiveness of the body itself. It needs external challenge to stay sharp.
So what's Mill's guiding principle for good governance then, balancing efficiency and freedom?
He summarizes it beautifully. The greatest dissemination of power consistent with efficiency, but the greatest possible centralization of information and diffusion of it from the center. Let local bodies and individuals manage actual business and execution, dissemination of power, but have a central body focus on gathering all the knowledge and experience generated everywhere, comparing it, and then sharing that information widely so everyone can benefit. Centralization and diffusion of information. The central body advises and informs, but doesn't dictate local action unless it violates general laws.
So local control, central knowledge sharing.
That's the ideal balance he proposes, and it all comes back to the ultimate value. The worth of a state, in the long run, is the worth of the individuals composing it. A state that prioritizes making its government machine run smoothly or achieving some immediate result by dwarfing its men, by suppressing their vitality and individuality to make them more docile instruments, that state will find that with small men, no great thing can really be accomplished. In the end, sacrificing the individual for the system will avail it nothing. #tag show and just outro. You know, rereading Mill's On Liberty, you're just struck by how powerful and enduring his arguments remain. It's such a profound defense of individual freedom, not as some abstract concept, but as something absolutely vital. Vital for finding truth, vital for developing our full human potential, and ultimately vital for a dynamic, flourishing society. Those four grounds for absolute freedom of thought and discussion, and that passionate case for individuality. They really emphasize that progress itself relies on this constant, sometimes messy collision of ideas and the space for diverse characters to truly thrive.
Absolutely. And what a journey it's been unpacking Mill's arguments together. We've explored his really crucial insights about the dangers of the tyranny of the majority, the absolute necessity of debate for keeping truth alive and meaningful, the subtle ways custom can stifle us, and that critical role the state should play enabling our growth, not dictating it, not stifling individuality. Mill leaves us with this pertinent warning, doesn't he? He says that unless a strong barrier of moral conviction can be raised against the mischief, meaning society's encroachment on individual liberty, we must expect to see it increase. So the question for you listening now as you go about your day in our contemporary world is, what do you think constitutes that strong barrier of moral conviction in your daily life? And maybe how might you contribute even in small ways to building or reinforcing it? Mill leaves us with this potent warning, doesn't he? He says that unless a strong barrier of moral conviction can be raised against the mischief, meaning society's encroachment on individual liberty, we must expect to see it increase. So the question for you, listening now, as you go about your day in our contemporary world is, it's worth observing these dynamics, the pressures for conformity, the spaces for dissent, the value placed on individuality in your own communities, in your workplaces, online. And just consider how you might help foster a bit more freedom and genuine individuality in both thought and action. Mill leaves us with this potent warning, doesn't he? He says that unless a strong barrier of moral conviction can be raised against the mischief, meaning society's encroachment on individual liberty, we must expect to see it increase. So the question for you listening now as you go about your day in our contemporary world is, thank you so much for joining us on this deep